Oh, how the pangs of nostalgia weigh heavily on the wallet. We've all been there. You find yourself pining for that game that you used to love as a child, that your cursed parents sent to landfill believing that you were too old to be playing with such toys now. Well, who looks foolish now, parents, because I'm still playing with them at the age of 40. If you've ever been in the situation of wanting to buy an old game, you've probably been faced with the dilemma of weighing up condition versus cost. Yes, you could buy this mint condition one, but it's almost twice the price of this one, which looks a bit battered and the contents haven't been checked, and the seller's feedback looks a bit dodgy, but surely with a bit of paint stripper, glue and a few eBay purchases, it could look just as nice and for much less money. Well, at the beginning of the year I found myself on the sticky end of that spectrum as I made my way to pick up a sold as seen job lot of incomplete classic tabletop games, which I'd seen advertised on the cyberspace car boot sale that is Facebook Marketplace. Just £100 for HeroQuest, Space Crusade, Advanced Space Crusade, Necromunda and... Blood Ferrets? What the is Blood Ferrets? Oh, Blood Berets. What the is Blood Berets? Anyway, it certainly seemed like a steal, but with some vague wording about completeness and equally vague pictures of the contents, I was taking a bit of a gamble. With the games secured and brought home, it was time to see exactly what I'd brought. First up was HeroQuest, which upon opening the box did make my heart sink a little bit. All of the miniatures and furniture were missing, though strangely a couple of advanced HeroQuest miniatures were in there. On the positive side, all of the cards were in there, as well as the board, dice, doors and rulebooks, all of which were in good condition. Still, not a great start, but HeroQuest is a game I do already own. At this point I wasn't too disappointed. Next, I opened up Space Crusade, which I don't own and would very much like to, and initially things looked a bit more positive. There were at least some miniatures in there, though clearly many, in fact most, were missing. Also missing were several cards, tokens, scenery pieces and countless other little gubbins. Again, not looking great. I then turned my attention to Berets, which is a game set in Heartbreaker's Mutant Chronicles universe apparently. It's not something that ever took off in the UK as far as I'm aware, probably due to Games Workshop having already monopolised the market. Blood Berets seems to be Heartbreaker's attempt to find the mass market appeal of something like a HeroQuest or Space Crusade. It's an RPG-like dungeon crawler of sorts, and actually looks pretty cool on the face of it, and things seem pretty good with my copy here. All of the miniatures were present, as well as the board sections, cards and rules. Frustratingly, however, many of the little tokens were missing, and I'm not confident finding spares will be possible. Necromunda was next, and the weighty box was pleasingly rammed. However, on inspection, most of the actual game was missing. The gangs, apart from their weapon arms, the rulebooks and the all-important whippy sticks, all absent. What was there was a bajillion bulkheads and a massive stack of card terrain. Clearly it was more than just the stuff that came with the game. I recognised the Outlander supplement stuff, but there seemed to be even more still. It wasn't until I sorted it properly that I realised I was looking at a complete Imperial Firebase set, as well as part of a Bastion. 2 classic 2nd edition 40k terrain sets. Not at all what I expected to find, but a win nonetheless. And as I already own a copy of Necromunda, I was reasonably happy with this big box of terrain. Last up was Advanced Space Crusade. This is a game I only became aware of recently, thanks to an excellent Always Bored Never Boring video, and out of all of them, it was the one I was most hoping would be closest to complete. Not only is it potentially the most valuable, but it's also the one that I was most keen to add to my collection. Well, of the Games Workshop games, it probably was the closest to completion, having all of the cards, board sections, tokens, trackers and most of the miniatures. Notably absent, however, was the rulebook. Not ideal, but I was able to find a PDF copy, 1 Space Marine Scout and a gun arm for another, 3 Space Marine Scout Sergeants and 5 of the 6 Tyrannid Warriors. That all seemed pretty doable to me. That was until I noticed that Tyrannid Warriors typically sell for around £25 each. Oh. Scattered throughout the boxes I also found a few random bits and bobs. Part of a Dragon Ogre, some bits from a TSR Dragon, a 1st edition Space Hulk Librarian and a bunch of armless plastic Genestealer hybrids. So, all in all, this hadn't been quite the score I'd hoped it would be. Completing any of these games would likely turn into a massive money pit, and so the sensible thing to do would be to just sell them individually, as is, and hope to make my money back or even make a little bit of profit. But this isn't a sensible hobby, and I like a challenge. So I made a list of the parts I would need to complete 3 of the games: HeroQuest, Space Crusade, and Advanced Space Crusade. A long list. For Necromunda, I plan to sell off the terrain sets to fund my shopping list, and for Blood Berets, well, you just hang out over there, I suppose. My first eBay pickup came in the form of 7 Space Marine Sergeants for £15. I stripped them, kept my favourites, and then sold on the remaining 4 for £9. By the way, for things I've bought I'm including postage paid, and for things I'm selling I'm only counting actual profit after postage and fees. I then managed to find 3 slightly broken but repairable Tyrannid Warriors for £25.94p, which I was then able to clean up pretty successfully. Things were looking promising for Advanced Space Crusade. For Space Crusade, I found a complete set of Orcs and Gretchen for £16.20, giving me some Orc spares to sell on. I then found a mixed lot of HeroQuest furniture, advanced HeroQuest tokens, and a lot of random Space Crusade bits, including most of a Chaos Dreadnought, just missing the legs and some weapons. This job lot cost me £24.31, and thanks to the unusual bits included, I was able to sell on what I didn't need and effectively make my money back. I then spotted a cheap job lot of Space Marines and Chaos Space Marines which I needed for Space Crusade. At £23.94 it was much lower than the going rate, but there were a few missing weapons and backpacks which would still need to be found. I won an auction for a pair of Chaos Dreadnought legs for just over £10, completing one of the more expensive miniatures I needed, though he still needed a couple of his weapon options. For £18.38 I found another job lot of Space Crusade minis, which gave me the remainder of my Space Marines and some more bits to sell on. I then picked up all but one of the cards I was missing for £6.10 from someone who was selling them individually. Having bought quite a bit but still being a long way from completion, it really started to hit home just how much of a money pit Space Crusade was proving to be. Buying these bits from resellers also made me realise that the set I was trying to complete had likely been a set that was broken up to sell as spares, hence why it was so incomplete. The ridiculousness of what I was doing suddenly hit me. I asked around on some Facebook and Discord groups for help, and in an amazing act of generosity, someone offered to send me nearly everything I had left on my list for free. I repeatedly asked if I could give them at least something for them, but they were insistent, and so I very graciously accepted this kind offer. What an amazing community we have in this hobby. That just left me with the wall sections and some docking boards to find, which I later did for around £15 to £20 for the lot. And with that I now had a fully playable copy of Space Crusade. My total spend to obtain the missing pieces was just over £100, and so far I've managed to claw back around £35 of that in the spare bits I've sold, but I still have quite a few bits yet to sell on. As it stands, including the £20 I spent on the game originally, this copy of Space Crusade has set me back around £85. As the game typically sells for over £100, that's not too shabby, but not exactly the bargain of the century either. If it wasn't for the kind generosity of a stranger, this would have almost certainly been an uneconomic venture. So I did get very lucky there. The kind generosity has also made me slightly embarrassed to sell on the rest of my spares, and so many of those might get passed on in a similar fashion. You know, pay it forward and all that. Whatever lesson I had learnt from Space Crusade, I was in too deep to stop now. I soon spotted a full set of HeroQuest miniatures for the very reasonable price of £34, all looking brand spanking new. I finished off with an equally nice set of character cards for £3.30, and that was everything ticked off for HeroQuest. Despite looking pretty bare upon first opening, HeroQuest had actually been considerably cheaper to complete. Of course it helped that the furniture was obtained in a job lot that basically paid for itself. It was only the last 2 purchases to add to the original £20 spent, meaning that it cost me around £60 all in. I thought this was a decent success, but I've since realised that HeroQuest prices ain't what they used to be. Good sets routinely sell for under £50 now, probably thanks to the success of the modern remake. Some years ago a good set would have set you back around £100, but it just goes to show, these things don't always go up in value. As it is, I'm left with a set I'll probably struggle to break even on. However, as it did turn out to be quite nice, I'd be happy to keep it as an upgrade to my own set. With just one game left to complete, I soon found another job lot of Tyrannid Warriors for the bargain price of £33.97. Included were 3 with bioweapons, which were all in good shape, and 3 others which were in various broken pieces. This made the previous ones I'd picked up slightly redundant, but at least I could find the best of the bunch for my set and sell on a couple of others to keep the overall cost down. It was a couple of months later when I finally found a copy of the rulebook for £11.64. I had seen a couple beforehand, but they were considerably more than I was willing to pay, especially seeing as I already had the PDF. This seemed like a pretty good price though, and so I picked it up. It's not in perfect condition, but for completion's sake I'm more than happy with it. Not entirely unrelated, a couple of days later I bought some arms for the Genestealer hybrids I'd found in one of the boxes. £22.99 might seem like a lot for some arms, but these miniatures are surprisingly valuable, and seeing as I got mine effectively for free, spending £23 on completing them seemed like a good idea. I think there are rules for including them in both of the Space Crusade games and also Space Hulk, so they're quite a useful thing to own. The last scout bits I needed to complete my Advanced Space Crusade set were picked up a month later for £9.17, which again left me with a few spares to sell on. With that, the set was finally complete, and the final spend, including the £20 I paid originally, was a hefty £115. Oof. The Sergeants I'd sold earlier brought that down to £106, but even so, completing the game hadn't been cheap. That said, I still have a few Tyrannid Warriors I can sell on and a couple of Scouts, which probably have a realistic value of around £40, which would bring down the overall cost quite a bit. As it stands, however, £106 is a decent price to pay for the game. Many sellers are asking anything from £150 to well over £200, depending on the condition. The market for the game doesn't seem to be particularly large, however, so auctions can often sell for much lower. So now I have complete copies of HeroQuest, Space Crusade and Advanced Space Crusade, which have cost me a total of £251, and quite a lot of time and effort. I've stripped miniatures, scoured eBay for hours, packaged and sent off spares, and I've still spent a small fortune. Not exactly a roaring success from what I thought was an absolute steal of a Facebook Marketplace find. My only glimmer of hope was that I still had the contents of the Necromunda box to sell, and a few other random little bits that were included. I was able to sell the TSR bits for £7.30, the Advanced HeroQuest character for £7.50, and the Dragon Ogre bits for £4. The Imperial Firebase and the Bastion, which I was sorry to see go to be honest, sold for a very respectable £64. The Necromunda bits, which was the full set of card terrain for the base game and Outlander, as well as the tokens and templates, sold for £67.50. Altogether that totted up to an impressive £150, bringing down the cost of my 3 complete games to a much more respectable £100. As I sell my spares, that number will of course come down even further, but at £100 I think I can call it somewhat of a success? Nah, who am I kidding? This experiment has led me to the conclusion that buying incomplete copies of vintage Games Workshop games just isn't worth it, at least if you're hoping to complete them. £20 per game felt like an absolute steal, but honestly, even with a lot of patience, frugality and effort on my part, the end result is hard to justify. If you're looking to add some classic games to your collection, the best thing you can do is set yourself a price you're happy to pay and set up some alerts on eBay. With a bit of patience, you'll find plenty of bargains to be had without all of the faff that I had to endure. Nevertheless, I am happy to have added these 3 games to my collection, and the satisfaction I gained from completing them definitely counts for something. Now I just need to convince someone to play them with me. Happy tabletop game hunting, everyone.